The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant, a place where hope usually went to wait in line. Morning light filtered through tall windows, cutting pale lines across the floor. At the defense table sat a black woman in a simple gray coat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her name was Grace Carter. She looked calm, almost too calm, as murmurs rippled behind her. Up on the bench, Judge Harold Whitman adjusted his glasses and smirked. When Grace tried to speak, he chuckled under his breath, a sound sharp enough to sting. A few people laughed with him. Grace lowered her eyes, not in shame, but in patience. Before the story pulls you any deeper, let me ask you something gently. Where are you watching from right now? It still amazes me how one moment, one story, can travel across cities, countries, and hearts. Share your place below. It reminds us none of us are truly alone in listening. Grace hadn't always been calm. Years ago, her hands used to shake when authority figures spoke too loudly. That fear had been learned early, stitched into her childhood like a quiet scar. She grew up in a narrow apartment on the south side of Cleveland, where sirens were part of the night soundtrack and survival meant learning when to stay silent. Her mother, Evelyn, worked double shifts as a hospital cleaner. Her father left before Grace learned multiplication. School taught Grace 2 lessons. The first was how to read books faster than anyone else in class. The second was how easily teachers underestimated her. When she raised her hand, they rarely called on her. When she corrected them, they smiled thinly, the kind of smile that said know your place. Still, Grace studied relentlessly. She studied on buses, in laundromats, under flickering kitchen lights while her mother slept in the next room.
Good morning.
Law books came later, after scholarships no one expected her to win. Each page was heavy, not just with words, but with the weight of proving she belonged. Back in the courtroom, Judge Whitman leaned forward. "Ms. Carter," he said slowly, savoring the moment, "do you even understand the charges being discussed here?" A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Grace looked up, her eyes steady. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied softly. Whitman shook his head, amused. "We'll see about that." The case itself was small, a procedural review, something most judges rush through before lunch. Grace was there representing herself, which already marked her as an oddity. People whispered. Some assumed she couldn't afford a lawyer. Others assumed she didn't know better. No one assumed she was prepared. As the prosecutor droned on, Grace listened with complete focus. She noticed every misquoted statute, every skipped precedent. She wrote nothing down. She didn't need to. The law lived in her memory like a second language. When it was her turn again, Grace stood. Her chair scraped softly against the floor. "Your Honor," she began, with respect, "the prosecution's interpretation of Section 14 is incomplete." Judge Whitman laughed openly this time.
Yes, Your Honor.
"Incomplete," he repeated. "Ms. Carter, I've been on this bench for 23 years. "I'm aware," Grace said. The room stilled, just a fraction. Whitman waved a hand. "Sit down before you embarrass yourself further." Grace sat.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Slowly. Not because she was defeated, but because she was choosing her moment. That choice came from experience. From years of being interrupted in meetings, spoken over in hearings, dismissed before finishing a sentence. Grace had learned that power often mistook silence for weakness. She had also learned that timing could change everything. As the hearing dragged on, something subtle shifted. A court clerk frowned at her notes. A young intern in the back leaned forward, sensing tension he didn't understand yet. Grace's calm wasn't empty, it was coiled. When Judge Whitman finally announced his preliminary leaning, clearly unfavorable, Grace rose again. "Your Honor," she said, louder now, steady but firm, "before you finalize that ruling, I formally request the opportunity to cite controlling Supreme Court precedent." The word Supreme hung in the air longer than it should have. Whitman scoffed. "Denied." Grace didn't sit this time. "With respect," she continued, "denial would be inconsistent with constitutional procedure." A few gasps escaped the gallery. Whitman's smile faded. "Ms. Carter," he snapped, "this court will not be lectured by someone who knows the law." Grace finished quietly. The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable. You could hear the buzz of the lights above. And in that moment, when Grace stood alone, mocked, underestimated, yet unbroken, the question lingered in the room like a held breath. If you were standing there, watching her be laughed at for simply knowing her worth, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up, or stayed silent like most did? Tell me honestly in the comments. And if this moment stirred something in you, tap like, not out of habit, but to say dignity deserves to be seen. Grace reached into her coat then, not hurried, not dramatic, and removed a folded document. Her fingers were steady now. She hadn't come to beg. She hadn't come to impress. She had come to reveal the truth.
Yes, Your Honor.
She stepped forward, placing the paper gently on the clerk's desk as the judge watched, confused and irritated. Grace met his eyes one last time, not with anger, but with certainty. And just as the clerk unfolded the document, the room began to change in a way no one there would ever forget. The clerk's eyes moved quickly over the document. At first, her expression was neutral, trained, procedural. Then her brows tightened. She reread the header once more, slower this time, as if her mind needed confirmation before her heart could accept it. Judge Whitman noticed the change. "What is it?" he asked sharply. The clerk didn't answer immediately. She stood, walked closer to the bench, and held the paper with both hands. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was no longer routine. "Your Honor, this document confirms Ms. Grace Carter's credentials." Grace remained still. Her heartbeat was steady, but memories were not. As the room waited, her mind drifted backward, not to triumph, but to the long road that made this moment possible. Years earlier, Grace had almost quit law school. It happened during her second year, after a professor returned her paper with a single sentence written in red ink, ambitious, but unrealistic. When she asked what he meant, he smiled politely and said, "Supreme Court aspirations require a certain background." That night, Grace sat alone in her dorm room, the city lights blinking through the window like distant signals she couldn't reach. She called her mother. "Maybe he's right," Grace whispered. "Maybe I'm reaching too far." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Baby, nobody ever tells you you're reaching too far when you're reaching for less than you deserve." Grace stayed. She stayed through the internships where she was mistaken for an assistant. Through interviews where panels asked if she was prepared for the pressure. Through clerkships where colleagues praised her work but passed promotions to someone else. Every closed door sharpened her resolve instead of dulling it. Back in the courtroom, Judge Whitman leaned forward now, irritation creeping into uncertainty. "Well," he pressed. The clerk swallowed. "Ms. Carter is currently serving as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Her presence today is part of an internal judicial review." A sound escaped the room, not quite a gasp, not quite a breath, more like disbelief cracking open. Whitman laughed reflexively. "That's not possible." Grace finally spoke again. "It is." The judge's face drained of color. He looked at the document himself now, scanning signatures he recognized instantly. His hand trembled, just slightly, as reality settled in. The woman he had mocked. The woman he had laughed at. The woman he had denied respect. She outranked him in every way that mattered. Grace didn't smile. She didn't gloat. Her expression held something far heavier, a quiet sadness born from knowing this moment wasn't unique. That countless others without her title endured the same treatment daily, without a reveal to save them. Have you ever had someone stand beside you when the world kept pushing you down? Someone who believed in you before you believed in yourself? If so, write yes, and say their name below. Sometimes gratitude, when spoken, travels further than silence ever could. Judge Whitman cleared his throat. "Justice Carter, I wasn't informed." "No," Grace interrupted gently. "You weren't respectful." The word landed harder than anger ever could. She turned slightly, addressing the room now, the clerks, the attorneys, the observers who had laughed earlier. "I didn't come here to shame anyone," she said. "I came because power should be examined, especially when it forgets who it serves." Silence held them all. Grace explained then, calmly, precisely, that the hearing was part of a broader evaluation into judicial conduct. Complaints. Patterns. behavior that discouraged fairness under the guise of authority. Whitman's courtroom had surfaced more than once. Each sentence was measured, each fact undeniable. Whitman's shoulders sank as if the bench itself had grown heavier beneath him. For a moment, Grace saw not a judge, but a man, aging, cornered by his own actions. And still, compassion flickered in her chest. Not forgiveness yet, but understanding. Understanding that systems don't rot overnight. They decay slowly through small unchecked moments, like laughter at the wrong time, or dismissing a voice that sounds different. As proceedings adjourned abruptly, people avoided Grace's gaze. Some out of shame, some out of awe. One young law student lingered near the door, eyes shining. "Thank you," he whispered as she passed. Grace nodded. "Carry it forward." Outside, the afternoon sun felt warmer than before. Grace paused on the courthouse steps, breathing deeply, grounding herself. Victory didn't feel loud. It felt heavy. Necessary. She knew this moment would ripple, through Whitman's career, through the clerks who witnessed it, through the stories told later in hushed tones. But more importantly, she hoped it would ripple through the unseen, through people who looked like her, who sounded like her, who had been laughed at and told to sit down. Grace adjusted her coat and stepped into the crowd, unaware that this was only the beginning of the reckoning, and that the hardest choice, what came next, was still waiting ahead. The city swallowed Grace as she moved down the courthouse steps, blending back into ordinary motion, car horns, hurried footsteps, a siren crying somewhere far away. To anyone passing by, she was just another woman in a gray coat. No one pointed. No one bowed. And strangely, she preferred it that way. Her phone buzzed once. Then again. Messages stacked faster than she could read them. Colleagues, reporters, former classmates, even distant relatives who suddenly remembered her name. Grace slid the phone back into her pocket without responding. Right now, noise felt intrusive. She walked instead. Each step echoed with memories she hadn't planned to revisit. The laughter in the courtroom had unlocked something old, a moment she usually kept sealed. She had been 13, standing in a school hallway after being accused of cheating on a math test. The teacher hadn't looked at her paper, hadn't checked the answers. He had simply said, "Be honest," with a tone that already assumed the lie. Grace remembered the heat in her face, the way silence pressed on her chest until she nodded just to make it stop. That was the first time she learned how easily dignity could be taken, and how rarely it was given back. Grace crossed the street now, the walk signal blinking red behind her. She wondered how many people lived their whole lives swallowing moments like that, never getting the chance to correct the record. Her car waited at the curb, but she didn't unlock it yet. Across the street, she noticed a young woman sitting on the steps of a closed cafe, shoulders slumped, face buried in her hands. A backpack lay beside her, worn thin at the seams. Grace hesitated. She could keep walking. She had meetings, responsibilities, a system to help fix. But some instincts never left you. Grace crossed the street again. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. The woman startled, wiping her face quickly. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just bad day." Grace smiled gently. "Those usually don't happen on cafe steps." The woman laughed weakly. "I just got turned down. Another interview. They said I wasn't a good fit." Her voice cracked on the last words. "I did everything right." Grace sat beside her without asking. The concrete was cold even through her coat. "Sometimes," Grace said, "doing everything right scares people who never had to." The woman looked at her, really looked this time. "What do you do?" Grace paused. Titles felt heavy today. "I listen," she said, "and sometimes I stay." They sat in quiet for a minute, the city breathing around them. Moments like this mattered to Grace more than the courtroom ever could. Because power wasn't proven in grand reveals. It was proven in who you noticed when no one was watching. Now let me ask you something, not as a viewer, but as a human being. What's one small good thing you've done recently, even if no one applauded it? Share it below. Your moment might remind someone reading that kindness still lives, and that their effort mattered too. Grace eventually stood, offering the woman her card, not the official one, but the simple personal number written on the back. "Call me," she said. "Not for favors. Just if you need to be heard." As Grace drove away, something loosened in her chest. The day hadn't been about exposure. It had been about alignment, remembering who she was before the robe, before the title, before the expectations. That evening, Grace sat alone in her apartment, lights low, city glow slipping through the windows. She reheated leftover soup and ate standing up, still in her coat. The television murmured quietly in the background until a familiar headline caught her ear. Local judge under review following courtroom conduct concerns. Grace turned the volume down. This part would move fast now. Investigations always did once light touched them. Her phone rang again. "This time," she answered. "Grace," said a familiar voice. "Michael Reyes, a fellow justice and longtime friend. You okay?" She considered the question. "I think so. You shook a lot of people today." "I didn't mean to." Michael sighed. "Intent doesn't change impact." "No," Grace said softly. "But silence would have." There was a pause on the line, the kind shared only by people who understood the weight of decisions. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Michael asked. Grace looked around her small apartment, the framed photo of her mother on the wall, the bookshelf bowing under years of study, the quiet proof of a life built without shortcuts. "I've been ready my whole life," she said. Outside, night settled in. Somewhere across the city, Judge Whitman sat alone too, staring at a future he hadn't imagined that morning. Two lives, moving in opposite directions now, bound by one moment of truth. And as Grace finally slipped off her coat and exhaled the day from her bones, she knew the hardest part wasn't being underestimated anymore. The hardest part was deciding how much grace to give to someone who had given her none. That choice was coming. And when it did, it would test not her authority, but her heart. Judge Whitman sat alone in his study, the lamp on his desk casting a tired yellow circle over stacks of unopened mail. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that amplified every thought. His robe lay draped over a chair, suddenly looking less like authority and more like costume. He replayed the moment again and again. The laugh, the smirk, the way the room had shifted when the clerk spoke. Supreme Court Justice. The word still felt unreal in his mouth. Whitman had always believed himself fair. Traditional, certainly. But unfair? Never. That belief had protected him for decades, cushioning him from reflection. Tonight, it shattered. Across the city, Grace stood on her balcony, wrapped in a sweater, watching headlights drift below like slow-moving stars. The air was cool, grounding. She thought she would feel triumph, or at least relief. Instead, there was a dull ache behind her ribs. Because the reveal hadn't erased the insult. It had only explained why it stopped. She remembered the faces in the courtroom, the laughter that vanished once her title surfaced. Respect that arrived late and conditional. If that realization hit you in the chest the way it hit her, leave a red heart. Some truths don't need words, they just need to be felt. The next morning, news spread quickly. Clips circulated. Headlines sharpened. Comment sections burned with outrage and praise tangled together. Grace avoided them all. She knew better than to look for herself in strangers' opinions. Instead, she went to work. At the Supreme Court building, her steps echoed through familiar halls. Clerks nodded respectfully, but there was a new softness in their eyes, admiration edged with concern. Grace closed her office door and sat at her desk, staring at the case files waiting patiently for her attention. She didn't open them. Instead, she opened a thin folder marked Whitman-ish. Complaints. Patterns. Statements from attorneys who had felt small in his courtroom. Notes from defendants who believed they'd been dismissed before being heard. None of it screamed cruelty. That was the problem. It whispered bias. Grace leaned back, closing her eyes. She thought of her mother's hands, cracked from cleaning chemicals, gentle when braiding Grace's hair at night. She thought of every time Evelyn had swallowed disrespect just to keep a paycheck. No reveal ever came for her. Grace understood then. Justice wasn't just about consequence. It was about interruption, stopping harm before it became tradition. Later that day, Grace requested a private meeting. Judge Whitman arrived stiffly, older than she remembered. Without the bench beneath him, he seemed smaller, not weak, just human. He didn't sit until she gestured. "Justice Carter," he began. "I want to apologize." Grace studied him. "For what?" He swallowed. "For yesterday. For my behavior." She nodded once. "And the years before yesterday?" The question landed gently, but it landed. Whitman looked down. "I didn't see it." "That," Grace said softly, "is the most honest answer you could give." They spoke for nearly an hour. Not defensively. Not theatrically. About power. Habit. Blind spots built brick by brick over decades. Whitman didn't excuse himself, and Grace didn't absolve him. When the meeting ended, nothing felt resolved. But something felt possible. As Whitman stood to leave, he paused. "You could ruin me," he said quietly. Grace met his eyes. "I could. Or I could make sure you never laugh at the wrong person again." He nodded, understanding the weight of mercy far better than punishment in that moment. After he left, Grace sat alone, hands folded like they had been in the courtroom. Only now, the silence felt different. Not oppressive, but open. She knew critics would question her choice. Some already would. Mercy was never popular when anger felt justified. But Grace also knew something deeper. Real justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it taught. And as evening light crept across her office floor, Grace prepared herself, not for applause or backlash, but for the quiet work of turning a moment of humiliation into a turning point. Because the story wasn't ending yet. It was bending, slowly, toward something better. And just ahead, waiting patiently, was the hardest test of all. Whether forgiveness could exist without forgetting. The rain began without warning that night, thin at first, then steady, tapping against Grace's windows like a question that refused to leave. She stood in the dark kitchen, a mug of untouched tea cooling between her palms. The meeting with Whitman replayed in fragments, not as scenes, but as feelings. "You could ruin me." The word stayed. Grace knew how easily the public story could go from accountability to spectacle. One statement. One recommendation. One vote. Whitman's career would collapse neatly, efficiently, and many would cheer. She wouldn't blame them. Pain often demanded payment. But something about his eyes in that office, stripped of ceremony, finally honest, unsettled her more than his laughter ever had. Grace sat at the small kitchen table, pulling out her notebook. She didn't write opinions there. She wrote truths she wasn't ready to say out loud. Why does forgiveness feel heavier than punishment? She wrote. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her mother. "Baby," Evelyn said, voice warm and tired. "You all right?" Grace smiled faintly. "I think I'm trying to be." Evelyn laughed softly. "That's usually when it matters most." Grace hesitated, then told her everything. The courtroom, the laughter, the reveal, the meeting afterward. She waited for anger. For fire. Instead, Evelyn was quiet. "Do you remember Mrs. Donnelly?" she asked finally. Grace frowned. "From your old job?" "The one who used to talk down to me like I was invisible," Evelyn said. "Years later, she got sick. Lost everything. I ran into her at the clinic." Grace remembered. Her mother had come home shaken that day. "I could have walked past her," Evelyn continued. "Part of me wanted to. But I didn't. I helped her fill out the forms." "Why?" Grace asked quietly. "Because if I let her turn me cruel," Evelyn said, "then she'd win twice." The rain pressed harder against the glass. After the call ended, Grace sat still for a long time. She thought of the young woman on the cafe steps. The law student who whispered thank you. The people who would never get a reveal, only the insult. Forgiveness wasn't about Whitman. It was about who Grace chose to become next. The following week, a review panel convened. Grace presented her findings plainly, patterns, testimonies, documented conduct. No embellishment. No protection either. The recommendation was clear: mandatory accountability measures, public acknowledgement, and oversight. Not erasure. Correction. Some panel members frowned. Others nodded slowly. "You're being lenient," one said. Grace met his gaze. I'm being intentional. Outside the chamber, reporters waited. Microphones stretched toward her like grasping hands. Grace stopped only once. Justice Carter, someone called, do you forgive him? Grace paused. The question carried weight, not because it was hard, but because it was easy to misunderstand. Forgiveness, she said carefully, is not forgetting. It's choosing not to let harm decide what happens next. Then she walked on. Be honest, if you were in her place, could you forgive after being laughed at, dismissed, reduced? Type forgive if you believe you could, or never if the wound would cut too deep. There's no wrong answer, only truth. The decision rippled fast. Whitman issued a public apology days later. It wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect. But it named the harm without defending it. Some accepted it. Many didn't. Grace expected that. What she didn't expect was the letter. It arrived handwritten, unassuming. Justice Carter, I am relearning how to listen. That work will take longer than I deserve. Thank you for not taking away my chance to do it. Grace folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. She didn't feel relief. She felt resolve. Weeks passed. The storm faded. New cases filled her days. But something subtle had changed, not in the world, but in Grace. She noticed herself standing a little straighter when young clerks spoke. Interrupting interruptions. Asking questions that made room instead of closing doors. Small corrections. Quiet ripples. One evening, as she left the building, she saw the same young law student from before waiting by the steps. I got into the program, he said breathlessly. They said my essay stood out. Grace smiled. Good. He hesitated. What happens when people doubt you again? Grace considered the question, then answered honestly. You let them, she said, and you keep going anyway. As she walked away, the city glowing ahead of her, Grace felt something settle, not peace exactly, but alignment. The hardest test hadn't been the courtroom. It had been choosing mercy without erasing truth. And now, as the story edged closer to its quiet resolution, one truth remained undeniable. Power could humiliate, but compassion could transform. And sometimes, the bravest justice was the one that taught the world how to change. Change didn't arrive loudly after that. It came quietly, like dust settling after a long storm. In Judge Whitman's courtroom, things began to shift. Attorneys noticed it first, the way he no longer interrupted mid-sentence, the way he asked clarifying questions instead of issuing assumptions. Defendants noticed too. They were allowed to finish speaking now. Sometimes Whitman even thanked them. It didn't erase the past. Nothing could. But it interrupted the future. Grace followed the updates from a distance, never commenting publicly, never claiming credit. Transformation, she believed, collapsed the moment it became performative. One afternoon, as she prepared to leave her office, a package waited on her desk. No return address. Inside was a slim book, a first-edition collection of essays on judicial humility, margins filled with handwritten notes. On the first page, a single line. Listening is the beginning of justice. Grace closed the book gently. She didn't need to guess who had sent it. That evening, she visited her mother. Evelyn's apartment smelled like simmering onions and home. The same kitchen table. The same worn chairs. Grace slipped out of her coat and sat, watching her mother move with familiar rhythm. You look lighter, Evelyn said without turning around. Grace smiled. I think I put something down I didn't know I was carrying. They ate together, talking about ordinary things. Neighbors, bills, a cousin's new baby. The normalcy grounded Grace more than any praise ever could. After dinner, they sat on the couch, the television murmuring softly. People keep calling you brave, Evelyn said. You feel brave. Grace thought for a moment. No, I felt scared. But I went forward anyway. Evelyn nodded. That's usually what brave really is. Weeks later, Grace was invited to speak at a small law school, not a grand lecture hall, just a classroom with mismatched chairs and flickering lights. The students leaned forward as she spoke, hungry not for prestige, but for truth. A student raised her hand. What do you do when the system hurts you, and no one believes you? Grace didn't answer immediately. She remembered the hallway at 13. The courtroom laughter. The years in between. You tell the truth anyway, she said. And if you ever gain power, you use it to widen the door behind you. Afterward, students lined up not for selfies, but for conversation. One said she'd almost dropped out. Another said he'd never seen someone who looked like him in Grace's position before. Each voice stitched something warmer into Grace's chest. Later that night, alone again, Grace walked the city streets. She passed the cafe steps where she'd met the young woman weeks earlier. This time, the steps were empty. But a chalk message marked the concrete. You belong here. Grace smiled. If you believe hope still survives, not loud hope, but quiet, stubborn hope, right in below. Let it sit there for someone scrolling in the dark, needing proof that things can change, even slowly. At the end of the month, the review board released its findings. The story resurfaced briefly, then faded, replaced by newer outrage, fresher noise. Grace welcomed the silence. Real progress rarely trended. One morning, an envelope appeared in her mailbox, this one from the young woman at the cafe. Inside was a short note. I got the job. You were right. Listening mattered. Grace held the note longer than necessary. She realized then that legacy wasn't built in courtrooms alone. It lived in moments no one archived. In pauses. In kindness offered without witnesses. That understanding softened something in her. Not weakened, softened. On a quiet Sunday, Grace returned to the courthouse steps alone. She sat where she had stood before, letting the sun warm her face. She thought of the woman she had been that morning. Calm, underestimated, patient. She was still all of those things. But now, she was something else too. She was proof. Proof that dignity didn't require volume. That justice could correct without destroying. That power, when held with care, could heal instead of harden. And as Grace rose and walked away, blending once more into the ordinary rhythm of the city, her story continued, not as a headline, but as a living thread woven quietly into the lives she touched. The end wasn't coming yet. But the meaning was already clear. Autumn arrived softly, brushing the city in amber and rust. Leaves gathered along sidewalks like forgotten letters, and the air carried that quiet reminder that seasons, like people, could change without announcing themselves. Grace noticed it most in the mornings. The way sunlight lingered longer on her window. The way she no longer braced herself before stepping into rooms of power. Not because resistance was gone, but because fear no longer led the way. One afternoon, she sat in the back of a modest community forum, listening rather than speaking. It wasn't televised. No press badges. Just folding chairs, a flickering microphone, and voices that had learned not to expect much from institutions. A man stood up, hands shaking slightly. I don't trust courts, he said plainly. Never have. No one corrected him. No one rushed to defend the system. Grace leaned forward. A woman followed. But lately, something feels different. Like we're being heard more. Grace didn't claim responsibility. She didn't interrupt. She simply listened, the way she once wished someone had listened to her. After the forum, a teenage girl approached her. Hoodie sleeves pulled over her hands. My brother's case is next month, she said. I'm scared. Grace met her at eye level. So is he. The girl nodded, eyes filling. What if they don't see him? Grace thought of the courtroom laughter. Of the reveal. Of everything that came after. Then we keep reminding them to, she said gently. Again and again. The girl exhaled, as if something heavy had been set down. That night, Grace returned home exhausted in the best way, the kind that came from purpose, not pressure. She kicked off her shoes and stood by the window, watching neighbors move through their lives. A couple arguing softly, a child chasing a ball, an elderly man feeding birds with careful hands. None of them knew her title. None of them needed to. Her phone buzzed with a message from Michael. You changed something, it read. Not just in the system. In people. Grace stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back. People change themselves. I just didn't get in the way. Later, as she lay in bed, sleep slow to come, Grace reflected on the strange truth she'd learned. that redemption didn't always belong to the person who'd been wronged or the one who'd caused harm. Sometimes it belonged to everyone watching. Because they carried the lesson forward. The next week, she received an invitation to return to Judge Whitman's courtroom, not as oversight, but as a guest observer. Grace hesitated, then accepted. The courtroom looked the same. Same wood. Same bench. But the air felt different. Whitman entered, paused briefly when he saw her, and nodded, not with authority, but with acknowledgement. The case that day was small. A nervous defendant. A public defender barely holding it together. Grace watched closely. When the defendant stumbled over his words, Whitman waited. Didn't interrupt. Didn't smirk. "Take your time," he said. Grace closed her eyes for just a second. That single sentence, so ordinary, felt monumental. As proceedings ended, Whitman approached her quietly. "I'm still learning," he said. "I always will be." Grace nodded. That's all anyone can ask. Outside, the sky stretched wide and blue. Grace felt something warm spread through her chest, not pride, but peace. If you believe that love still wins, not loudly, not perfectly, but persistently, comment yin. Let it sit there as a quiet signal to anyone who doubts that goodness can outlast harm. Grace walked on, hands in her coat pockets, blending once again into the flow of the city. She didn't need a reveal anymore. The work was speaking for itself, in changed behavior, softened voices, widened doors. Hope, she had learned, wasn't fragile. It was stubborn. And as long as even one person chose to listen instead of laugh, to lift instead of diminish, to forgive without forgetting, hope would keep finding its way forward. One step at a time. The end was near now, not as a conclusion, but as a gentle landing. Winter arrived quietly as it always did, not with drama, but with stillness. The city slowed. Breath turned visible. Windows glowed warmer against the dark. Grace walked home one evening beneath bare trees, her coat pulled tight, boots crunching softly over thin ice. She had declined another interview that day. Not out of exhaustion, but intention. Some stories, she believed, needed to rest. As she passed a small bookstore, she stopped. In the window was a handwritten sign. Author Talk Tonight, Justice and Mercy. Grace smiled to herself and kept walking. At home, she lit the single lamp and sat by the window, watching snow begin to fall. Each flake landed differently. No two alike. All part of the same quiet transformation. Her phone buzzed once more. A message from the law student she'd met months earlier. "I spoke up today. My voice shook, but I didn't stop. I thought you should know." Grace closed her eyes. That was it. Not the courtroom. Not the reveal. Not the apology. The ripple she'd hoped for, now moving without her. She thought again of that first moment. The laughter. The smirk. The way the room had assumed her place before she ever spoke. That wound hadn't disappeared. It never would. But it no longer defined her. Grace had learned something rare. Pain could either harden you into silence, or refine you into purpose. She rose and walked to the mirror. Not to admire herself, but to see clearly. She saw the girl who studied under flickering lights. The woman who stood calm while being laughed at. The justice who chose correction over destruction. All of them were still there. Grace whispered almost to herself, "Thank you." Not to the judge. Not to the system. To the version of herself that stayed. If this story moved you, don't scroll past it quietly. Tap like, not for me, but for the soul who carried this weight, stood in dignity, and chose compassion anyway. One click can be your way of saying, "I saw you. I felt it." And sometimes, that matters more than applause. The snow fell thicker now, softening edges, covering old marks on the street. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new conflicts, new chances to listen better than yesterday. Grace turned off the lamp and let the dark settle gently around her. Somewhere, another courtroom waited. Another voice trembled, unsure if it would be heard. And because of one moment, one choice, the world was just a little more ready to listen. Not because justice was perfect, but because someone had dared to hold it with grace.